After putting this game off for forever, I finally played through it earlier this year, and I had no idea what was going on. The dialogue in The Witcher 2 is extremely exposition heavy, and unlike the more ambiguous role-playing dialogue options you'd get in like Skyrim or Pillars, you are very much playing the role of a character whose character has already been written. Because this time, Geralt knows what he's doing. He's recovering his memory as the game goes on, so he's more of a Mary Sue now and less of a tutorial's amnesiac. Once Act 2 hits, he knows what's going on, even if the player doesn't. And once Act 2 hits, a lot is going on. My fond enough memories of the first game were prodding me into doing whatever I could to enjoy this sequel as much as possible, so after not knowing what this plot was doing at all, I decided to just go back and do them all from the beginning, and replay The Witchers. So this time, when I made it to number 2, I decided to keep a cheat sheet with me. I had a printed map on hand for pretty much the entire second run of this game, with names and events scribbled on the backside, and I'm not exactly happy with how important that cheat sheet ended up becoming. But I am happy that I read Sword of Destiny! As it turns out, the second Witcher book wasn't translated to English until May of this year, with the release of the third game, and even then that was only for the UK edition. North America's paperback isn't due until December. Considering the higher costs and shipping times of overseas delivery, I decided to take the ebook option for this one. And what a weird option that was to take. This is the second book of the series, but most of them have already been translated and printed in English, so it's only just now that we finally got number 2, even though numbers 3, 4, and 5 already made the transition years ago. It's also weird that this is the one they've been holding back on. I read a lot of commenters who seem to agree that this is the fan favorite of the series, and after reading it myself, I get it. Sword of Destiny is a short story collection just like The Last Wish, but this one has a much slower pace and a more contemplative tone. The stories are less about what a cool dude Geralt is, and more about what a confused dude Geralt is. There's a whole lot less time spent with him spinning around chopping up monsters than there is spent with him falling head over heels in love, running out of money, or feeling guilty for feeling obligated to raise new children witchers. A recurring theme has him trying to balance the detached brutality of his profession with the scraps of human emotion left over that might not have been fully trained out of him. It's almost like, maybe like the experiences of growing up with some artistically motivated desire to write fiction, despite also having to live with the more industrious demands of a Soviet communist economy, but maybe that's looking too deep into it. Either way, I was enraptured. After the pulpy, sexy fantasy of the first book, I wasn't expecting a heart-melting piece of literature about the terrifying inner conflicts of the human condition, or the Witcher condition, or something. My favorite story here ends on one of my favorite last-minute twists of any book, with a hungry, vicious werewolf sneaking up on our heroes before deciding to just sit and listen to this bard's sappy romantic song before walking away. It's a line that encapsulates the change of tone this second book makes, and also hints at the change of tone this second game makes. It's less about hunting monsters and twisting around fairy tales than it is about much more relatable human drama. And that's also what the game developers seem to have attempted with number 2. It's less about hunting monsters and more about navigating human conflicts. It has less fairy tale glades than it does muddy battlefields and military camps. You won't find any leprechauns prancing around Balvins in this one. Instead, you'll find a whole lot of politics and plot twists and big battle scenes and an overall attempt to polish this universe up for a mass-market multi-platform release. Instead of using outdated BioWare tech, they developed their own engine that looks damn good and scaled well enough for a console release. Suddenly, everyone's faces look like faces, and not potatoes. The voice actors sound like they're voice acting, and not swearing a courthouse oath. And you're no longer juggling around 30 different quests for the same fetch. The 2D flashbacks don't just zoom in and out of concept art, but have these slidey FMV animations that make Geralt look like a dried-up crunchy leaf. The UI is big and clunky, the visual style is blurry and bloomy, the rooms are way smaller, and there are these weirdly placed wooden gates that keep you from seeing very far, and wait a minute, I see what's going on here. They consoleized it! After a failed attempt to outsource a console version of the first game in 2009, the developers decided to just do it themselves for the sequel. A dev quote tells us, straight from the horse's mouth, that the whole interface was designed with consoles in mind. It's impossible for me to look at these menus and think otherwise. The grid inventory, the tooltips, the free cursor, and the hotbar of the original game's UI has been redesigned into slow, scale-form sub-menus that require multiple clicks to accomplish what took one click before. But now you have a few frames of input delay each time. The background has this goopy cell biology theme that doesn't exactly fit the style of the rest of the game. The first Witcher's interface was an eyesore, but it was way more functional than this one. Picking up an object off the ground used to be a point-and-click process. You could examine and use stuff in the same window you looted it out with. Now you have to fish it out from a list, reordering categories as you go. If you ever need to design an RPG interface, take note. It's way easier to imagine our hero stopping to take a break and flip through a notebook when you have papery sound effects and a referential background image, instead of abstract goopy sound effects and an abstract goopy background. Although I'm totally a Witcher guy, this just makes me really jealous that all those Dragon Age guys get to have their own PC interfaces every time they get a game, and that would be nice. Upon playing this game twice, I found that combat and movement now feels a whole lot better with the controller, but after making that switch, you have to go through the pause menu to access inventory and journals without hotkeys, and that becomes a nightmare of dead time adding up. And outside of those menus, they now have this game using a brawler-style control scheme, where they nixed away one of 3 attacks for a 2-attack plus block button hack-and-slash kind of layout. But despite the more action-gamey controls, it lacks action-gamey finesse and responsiveness. Connecting your sword to a bad guy's gut has less to do with your sword actually hitting them than it does to do with your camera being locked onto them, which is accomplished with this unwieldy combination of both your own placement and what you're vaguely looking at. This is the same way combat targeting was handled in the first game. It was just easier to handle because you could directly point and click on who you were attacking. Without having that cursor, the camera has to assume what you want to be targeting, and it's oftentimes wrong. When it is, you see all sorts of weird stuff happening. Your sword goes right through people, or people parry your blows in their standing animations. One straight-up numerical factor that could have made this combat so much more tolerable is the Backstab Bonus. Even though you have to target and lock onto enemies to attack, your camera and movement don't lock onto them. Unlike the targeting in Zelda or Demon Souls, you can't sidestep around enemies or backpedal. But without a shield or lots of crowd control options, your primary defense here is evasiveness. You have to roll around enemies and run away, and that's really the best way to stay alive, but you're also turning your back to enemies that get a 200% backstab bonus on you. Throw more than one enemy into the crowd, and suddenly you have fights where the majority of your health goes down within the first few frames. Thanks to that enormous backstab bonus and the weird collision detection, they just kind of have to wave their swords in the air in front of Geralt's backside, and then they're good to go. That's all they need. That's not great. For the record, I've fully played through this game 2 times with the combat rebalance mod and again without it, and neither experience was great. Between both these first 2 games, neither has combat that's great, and that has me seriously worried about how the third game's gonna play and feel. But the overall production of the second is a marked improvement over the first, even if a lot of The Witcher's more unique and charming ideas are played safer this time. There's still no lack of ambition for what it wants to do with its characters and its choices, though, like what it does with the Crinfid Reavers. In the book, these guys are horrible. They totally screw over Geralt and Yennefer, but if you didn't read it, you wouldn't know that. And neither does the amnesiac Geralt in the game.
Shut your trap, Desperate! The Witcher don't remember. Waste of words to remind him. We're old mates, that's that.
The lack of knowing that backstory is an experience shared by both the player and the character. The book readers have their opportunity to take revenge on these guys, but players without knowledge of them might be fooled. But then again, without them really harming our character in the here and now, does it really count as being fooled? Your decision on what to do with them comes back around hours later and determines whether the newest Crimson Reaver gets an opportunity to return your favor or not. The blood you inadvertently shed there can lead directly to blood on your hands later, which affects other characters' perception of you. One thing leads to another, and hours later, this same questline has you summoning up swamp ghosts for a witch in the woods. That dedication to long-term cause and effect is the primary selling point of this game. The end of Act 1 branches the story off into two incredibly different directions that it's more like playing two different campaigns. You end up in two different towns, then restricted areas from different parts of a third town, with different characters living and dying and different borders being drawn in the ground with a multitude of different outcomes gracefully written in and out of each other to account for whatever choices the player makes here. And this seems to be what reviewers and fans liked so much about this sequel. It had game-changing consequences. But the hyperbole over these game-changing consequences is a little bit of a misnomer. They are all pre-written for you. It's all pre-planned. And the extent to which they push them is, in its own way, limiting. Playing it a second time didn't just uncover how much content I had missed the first time. Seriously, give it a second go. The music in Vergen is way better than the Caedwin camp, but the second run also uncovered just how much context I had missed. Like I said in the beginning, I had no idea what was going on in this game for my first time through. Geralt's run-in with the Crinfid Reavers is just about the last time they make a clever writing play with his amnesia. As the game goes on, more of his memory comes back, and so does his knowledge of lore that the player needs to catch up with. He starts tossing around enough lore of his own that stuff your own character can say will be flying right over your own head. There's a serious disconnect when that happens. Seeing this conflict over the Pontar Valley play out from both sides felt less like a bonus than it did a necessity, especially since without this map I'd have no clue where the Pontar Valley is in relation to the aggressors fighting over it, but Geralt doesn't seem to have that problem. Whatever room for reactivity they gave this plot doesn't keep this plot from being a mess. It's not only convoluted for the sake of all the room for player choices that there is, but it's also full of tons of little convenient events that make little sense when you look at the greater picture. And this is where I have to spoil everything to explain myself. Cedric, a drunken elf in Flotsam, dies after centuries of experience, with his last words revealing that Sabrina's curse at Vergen in the future will help some amnesiac weirdo who walked into his town 2 days earlier to recover his memory. Okay. If you take Yorvis' path, Geralt just so happens to find Triss's figurine in the woods, because finding the figurine in the Nilfgaardian camp where it's supposed to be would be too simple or something. Roach looks like he dies on the bridge from the dragon, but he doesn't, and the only thing that really seems to change is that Geralt can say, "I thought you died" in the beginning. Mere seconds of this nameless priest appearing in a cutscene turns out to be the crux of a major subplot hours later when you've probably forgotten everything that happened. These are just a few of the countless, inconsequential little bumps in the road of this plot that you have to remember, or else a lot of lines make no sense. They don't add much to the plot. They're superfluous details that just left me confused that first time. And first impressions are pretty important. In Act 3, if you go after Triss, she acts surprised that you don't know about the Lodge. The Lodge of Sorceresses is a top-secret organization who might be behind all the craziness going on, except that it's not secret at all. It was talked about in the first game. Hell, it had its own journal entry in the first game. It's talked about in the second game before it becomes this grand reveal, and there is even a book about it being sold on the street in front of where captive Lodge members are being held.
How do you know of the Lodge?
I just do.
Maybe he read about it in the tourist brochure. It's a messy, overly complicated, confusing, exposition-heavy story, and I can't really fault it for any of that. It zigzags its way back and forth, all over the place, because it's juggling the conflicting goals of our Witcher himself, just like in this book. His primary motivation would seem to be clearing his name and proving he's not the assassin of kings, but as the two branching stories go on, he ends up being implicated in crimes just as, if not more, sinister. And the occasional moments implicating him in those crimes can be very well written.
A flea has bitten a lion.
Soon enough, more pressing goals appear than proving Geralt's innocence. And in any other story where a clear villain would ground our hero's progress through the whole adventure, this story has a reluctant villain who's actually really good at talking his way out of villainy at the very end. Maybe because he's not much of a villain at all. Letho and Geralt find each other at their throats because of bad luck. Neither of them are really invested in their causes or even each other, and that's a really unique and kind of brave spin on the revenge fantasy. As Geralt chases after this rival, the rival doesn't turn around, twirl his mustache, and unleash a bunch of dastardly traps. He really doesn't want anything to do with Geralt. Geralt is actually 100% the aggressor here. Letho still considers him a friend and is confused and frustrated by Geralt's insistence on hounding him.
Why do you hound me?
They think I killed Voltex.
It's your own fault for playing soldier boy.
And then, once it's all said and done with, after they've both been through far worse, they have an opportunity to reconsider. Even after both playthroughs, I couldn't bring myself to fight this guy. The second book's shift of focus from fairy tale subversion to human drama comes with the second game's shift of focus to brutally complex pretend politics. The plot's a mess, a coherent but almost incomprehensible series of forgettable minor events that end up adding up to huge consequences on a huge stage we see very little of. I'm just thankful that we have some strong characterization, at least grounding it. And while I understand the appeal of a more mundane or unconventional fantasy story, and while I recognize the value that reviewers are going to place on a pretty technically competent, polished game that also features exhaustive reactivity, and while I empathize with the value of a multi-platform release, I'm not sure I like this one. And I still consider myself a big fan of these games. But even after replaying it, it's fascinating as hell, but the combat just doesn't feel like it can be mastered. 2 playthroughs on hard mode had me stuck at fights that felt like crapshoots of barely connecting backstabs. Taking the time to prepare traps and a potion cocktail for crowd control requires you to wade through these slow-ass menus and watch this slow-ass animation, and even then, the buffs you get for it last just like 5 minutes. For a game emphasizing preparation before combat, your preparations don't yield you enough time to properly prepare for anything. By the time you have to fight something, it's too late. You can die in quick load and drink up again to account for those precious lost seconds, but that spoils the fun of having to prepare for it in the first place. They had this stuff figured out in the last game, where the buff timings and the alchemy system ended up giving the world a sense of place. It was a more honest and complete exploration of what makes this character interesting. You had to hunt monsters by their time of day, you had to study their tactics and plan potions and poisons according to the specific beasts. You had to rest and prepare an entire hour's worth of buffs at the tavern, rather than rushing through them all in smaller increments through the wilderness. And all of that made you care about where to go and when to go. You had to buy out an entire tavern supply of alcohol to make your potions, and maybe that's why the innkeepers don't like witchers so much, and maybe that gave you an excuse to get good at gambling. You had to chase devourers at night, but still leave room open in the schedule to turn the quest in at daytime. You really had to go out of your way to be this guy in the first game, to a much greater extent than you do in the second. It had a level of mechanical role-playing to it that made this character feel concrete and real. A set of difficult rules and realities you had to experience firsthand from this character's perspective, and that's something you can't get from a movie or even from a book. And in the process of scaling back on a lot of those lore-relevant mechanics, they also scaled back on the fairy tale mystique of it all. There is a troll under a bridge that charges a toll, and as it turns out, he's been depressed into alcoholism because the townsfolk slaughtered his wife, and that's freaking great! And just about the only time this game really feels like what I at least consider The Witcher to be about. I don't know if the later books try this much politicking, but without having the charm of centuries-old fairy tales on its side, The Witcher 2 feels more like a cheaper version of Game of Thrones or a crasser version of Dragon Age than it feels like its own unique brand. It's not a bad game overall, but its edge is far more dull. It strays from the clever and inventive ideas that made the first game what I think is the better one. Even though it was a duct-taped-together Frankenstein creature of barely working features, but I really wouldn't mind bringing that with me on a desert island, if I had to. So now I can only hope that the third game will make the best of both worlds.